Yeah. So welcome everybody to this week's Knowledge Thirsty Thursday. It's We're lucky to have Sarah King here with us. Um, she'll be presenting Alberta's archives dried out Prohibition in Alberta. So I'm personally very excited about this one. Um, so to start, I will do a land acknowledgement, if my computer works, sorry. So we'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territories of the Nitsit. I'm sorry, I really struggle with these. Niitsitapi, the Siksika, the Gaianai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Ea, this was one, Hey, Nakota, and everyone who makes their home in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, including the Métis Nation of Alberta and Battle River Territory. We encourage participants to reflect on how the colonization and collection of land relates to topics discussed today. And then I just go to the next slide. I just have some housekeeping to do before we do the presentation. I know we're limited in time here, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. So of course, as I'm sure everybody here has experienced issues with their technology, so please be forgiving if something goes wrong with the technology. It happens, which is exactly why I don't run things here. I just talk. So, um, you know, participate in a way that makes you feels good to you. I actually didn't ask Sarah if, do you want us to ask questions as they come up, or if you'd rather them save towards the end?
I did save time for questions at the end. So
Perfect.
if you have a question, write it down. That way we can just make sure uh, I don't miss anyone, I guess is what I'm saying.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, and it's okay not to know, but please be respectful. We all come from different walks of life. We just want to treat everybody with respect. Um, yes. So if you have a question, just you could write it in the chat box even, and we'll monitor that throughout. Yeah. And so please do not unmute until the end. And so all questions will be at the end. So thank you. And just a content warning. We want to acknowledge that there may be context within this presentation that can be activating. So if you find yourself having a response during or after the training, we encourage you to step away and engage in self-care. Talk to someone you know and trust. So friends, family, coworker, professional, and or the stress center at this number, which I think is in Calgary. That's the Calgary Distress Center, I believe. And so a couple of staff will stay on the call to offer support after until everybody leaves the meeting. And then just a little bit about Safe Link Alberta. We've been serving Medicine Hat and Calgary since 1983. Well, I guess maybe not Medicine. Well, anyway, we serve Medicine Hat in Calgary, and we've been around since 1983. Our mission is to reduce the harms associated with sexual activity and substance use by offering low barrier, non-judgmental, and informed programs and services. And our vision is inclusive empowerment and healthier communities. Like I had mentioned, we have offices in Medicine Hat and Calgary. We work with people living with HIV and hepatitis C, and that's Calgary program. Members of priority populations engaging in activities where there are the highest risk of contracting STBBIs. This includes sex workers, which is the SHIP program out of Calgary, the ethnocultural communities with a focus on African, Caribbean, and Black, ACB communities, which is a Calgary program as well. Cis and trans, gay, bi and queer guys, Indigenous communities, people who use substances, and people of reproductive age and ability, which is the WELL program, which is located in Medicine Hat. Okay. So today, like I mentioned, we're lucky to have Sarah King to guide us through our presentation. Sarah has a BA in history and a Master's of Library Information Studies. I think that's correct. From the University of Alberta. And from 2008 to 2012, she was a contract private records archivist. And since 2012, she has worked at the Provincial Archives of Alberta as a government records archivist. She's responsible for appraisal, description, and reference services. She served on the board of the Archive Society of Alberta, first as a secretary and then as vice president from 2015 to 2019, and has also volunteered on numerous Archive Society of Alberta committees. So we're super lucky to have her go through Alberta's history of prohibition. I know I'm very interested. There's a lot I don't know. So yeah, I think hold on a minute here. Oh, wait, I have one more thing to talk about. Sorry. If we go to the next slide, please, Eddie. So there's a post workshop survey. So please just take at the end if you don't mind taking the time to do the survey. We'd really appreciate it. And yeah, I think we could probably stop sharing, Eddie, and let Sarah go.
All right, there we go. Can everybody see it and hear me? Is that a yes?
You betcha. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to go into slide mode. Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone. As was mentioned, whoopsies. Okay, well, we'll just stay on that one. Hi. So my name is Sarah King, and I am a government record archivist at the Provincial Archives of Alberta. And I'll be giving this presentation today on prohibition in Alberta. Just a little bit of background on the Provincial Archives, if you're unfamiliar with us. We're located up here in Edmonton, and we're the official repository for the records of historical significance of the government of Alberta. So we're the official repository for the GOA. But we're also what's known as a total archive. So we collect the records of individuals, organizations, community groups, churches, municipalities, kind of anything and anyone. And those records come to us through private donation. So people will either seek us out or we might seek them out and ask them to donate their archival records. If you're unfamiliar with an archive, we're similar to museums, except that we collect records. So that can be paper or digital, audiovisual, things like films, as opposed to artifacts like a museum would. And also, unlike a library, what we collect is usually unique. So we're looking for unique things as opposed to published items. And while we don't loan materials out, items in our collection can be viewed in our reading room. And we're also working on getting a lot more materials up on our website so that people don't have to come to Edmonton in order to see them. And I'll also begin by acknowledging the land that I'm speaking to you from. So Edmonton, or Amiskwaciwâskahikan, I apologize for that, is on Treaty 6 and Métis territory. And this is the traditional home, meeting ground, and traveling route of the Nahenuak, Anishinaabe, Niitsitapi, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. And so, so the presentation I'm going to give you guys today is based on an exhibit that we created for the 100th anniversary of the repeal of Prohibition, which came into effect in Alberta on July 1st, 1916, and ended on November 6, 1923. And everything that is in here, so when we put together exhibits for us, we're trying to use things that use the documentary like the documentary history of the province. So if there are gaps and holes, which there are, it's usually just because we just don't have documents referring to those things. One of the issues with archival collections is that if people don't donate records about something, we just don't have a record of it. And that's just sort of the nature of archival work in general. So the popular conception of prohibition, when we think about prohibition, has really been shaped, not surprisingly, by the American experience of it, just as a nature of media. It came into effect at the dawn of the Jazz Age for them, reported on the radio, recorded in newsreels, and reflected in films of the motion picture industry, which was just kind of really starting up right around the same time Prohibition came into effect. But temperance in Alberta came much earlier. So most of the documentation we have of it is the media of pamphlets and songbooks and photographs, newsprint, those kind of things. And they were the primary sources that we used to develop the exhibit. The same arguments for and against would be made in both countries, but packaged for their respective audience and time using the tools that they had. Many of the same issues and themes that are explored here would be very familiar today in conversations regarding legalization and regulation of other drugs. So that conversation really has not changed a lot over the past 200 years. Prohibition, oh, there we go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is temperance. Prohibition came about in large part because of the temperance movement. And temperance started as a reaction to a real epidemic of alcoholism in the early 1800s in the Americas. Temperance just means moderation or self-restraint. There are a number of reasons why alcohol consumption increased really widely in this period. The first was honestly just because sugar was cheaper than it had ever been before. And sadly, that's in large part due to the slave trade. So if you're familiar with something called the Golden Triangle, it involved a wide increase in the production of sugar cane, and one of the products that was produced as a result of leftover products from that was rum, and lots of it. The Industrial Revolution also meant that alcohol was now being produced by large manufacturers on industrial scale for the first time. So this would have been something that would have been very small scale previously, and it sort of grew more and more as it went on. And many of the products being produced were now being distilled, and so they had a much higher alcohol content than people were previously used to. The last one's important to note because sources of fresh water were often contaminated, and alcoholic beverages were legitimately safer to drink. But most people did. Even children were more likely to be drinking. But we're talking about things like 3%, 2% level alcohol, very watered down wine or beer and that kind of stuff. And obviously there's a very large difference between those low alcohol things and distilled liquor, which had a much higher alcohol content. The first temperance societies were formed in the 1820s in Canada and the United States. And the goal really was just encouraging drinking alcohol in moderation. So they didn't want to ban it, they just wanted everybody to pull back quite a bit. So throughout the 1800s, temperance advocates began to take a harder line towards alcohol, promoting total abstinence. The T in total is actually where the term teetotaler comes from. And you really need to look at temperance within the context of the progressive movements of the time. So very much rooted in Christian, what they called revivalism. And its proponents really reviewed it as a new crusade. The picture that I have up here for the marching songs for young crusaders kind of gives you an idea of the language that was being used. Much of the work was directed towards children, so very similar to anti-drug use programs that we see today. And a lot of the educational content was just blatantly exaggerated. So kind of the, if you drink once, you're going to be an alcoholic forever and that kind of thing. It was directed at getting them to pledge to never try alcohol in the first place. So there were a lot of these pledge campaigns that would go around and sign up kids. The Marching Songs for Young Crusaders songbooks is kind of an example of, like I said, this propaganda aimed at a younger audience. And it really does use militaristic language, like it's, you know, young crusaders, temperance songs for the Cold Water Army. That was very typical of that period. And that one's from 1904. And I should note when I'm using progressive in this context, I'm really referring to a specific political, social, and religious movement in Canada and the US during the middle 19th century to the early 20th. It was the product of Protestant Christian, really white Protestant Christian communities focused on the idea of creating a better or perfect society. Well, many of the things people were advocating for were positive, so things like sanitation, prison reform, public education, and women's suffrage. Others had very less positive connotations, and I mean, probably the most awful of those was eugenics, which, if you're familiar with, was forced sterilization and other really horrible things. The poster that I have up here, one of the achievements of the movement was, in fact, better water quality, and water was now being presented as a safer alternative. So like on this temperance poster where they compare water versus alcohol. And again, this was pretty kind of typical propaganda, not propaganda, but the kind of thing they would put out. So temperance movement, with its aim from saving societies from the evils of drink, gave women cover to openly engage in what were really increasingly political activities. For a lot, like women were not supposed to engage in public life in this way, but this sort of gave them cover to do so. And one of the main arguments that would be made for women's suffrage was that if women could vote, they could bring in prohibition. The lady who's pictured there is Louise McKinney, and she was one of the members of the famous five who would bring the Persons case before the Privy Council in London, and that was a court case to determine that women were in fact people. At the time, the highest court in Canada was actually the Privy Council in London. And she was also one of the founding members of the Alberta branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She would serve as their president for 22 years, even after Prohibition was ended in favor of government regulation in 1923. They would continue on and they would shift their focus to banning alcohol on the grounds of traffic safety. Louise McKinney would continue to support temperance. Emily Murphy, who was another member of the famous five and the first female magistrate, not only in Canada, but in the British Empire, would instead come to favor regulated government sales, in part because prohibition was causing large-scale open defiance against the law. When Murphy passed away, she even owned stocks in whiskey distillery Hiram Walker Gooderham and Wirtz. So they were not all of the same mind about many things. So women would gain the right to vote in provincial elections in Alberta in 1916, and Louise McKinney, along with Roberta McAdams, would be the first women in Canada elected to a provincial legislature. Women in Canada overall would win the right to vote in federal elections in 1918. The timing of these wins and the passing of Prohibition would also be related to the First World War, as a significant number of men were overseas and women were also increasingly entering the workplace. So the balance of power had shifted a little bit in that regard. So an area that would choose to ban alcohol was generally referred to as being dry, and the same term would be applied to Prohibition supporters. So the most active groups in Alberta were the Alberta Temperance and Moral Reform League and Women's Christian Temperance Union. But there were many smaller local groups as well. These were just sort of the most well-known. And dry supporters were typically middle-class, white, Christian evangelists, lived in rural areas or smaller communities. And they approached temperance really with like the zeal of missionaries. And their efforts were not always welcomed by Catholics, immigrants, First Nations, and city dwellers who were basically having this forced on them, whether they wanted it or not. I always enjoyed the WCT one where they also want to get rid of dancing in schools because they were not a fun bunch a lot of the time. So the opposition was effectively collectively referred to as the Wets. And they opposed prohibition for a lot of different reasons, so they were not unified by any means. You had along with companies like brewers and distillers, which opposed it for obvious reasons. Bar and hotel owners viewed prohibition as a threat to their livelihoods. There were groups, members of cultural and religious groups that did not have negative connotations with alcohol. So, for instance, in Italian immigrant communities, French Catholic communities, they didn't see alcohol as a bad thing. And even some individuals who were sympathetic to the idea of temperance opposed prohibition on the grounds that the government shouldn't be legislating morality. There were also professional organizations on this side as well, like the Licensed Victualers Association, and that just meant essentially bar, they called it victualers, but people who sold alcohol, which represent many of the owners of local hotels, some of which were the most active in opposing local option laws. And those are localized laws that would ban alcohol in a particular area. So the first attempts at prohibition were these local option laws, allowing counties or towns to vote dry based on a simple majority vote. In 1902, Cardston County would become the first place in Alberta to ban alcohol sales by direct vote. And local option laws, they would meet with pretty limited success because people could and did go the town or county over and just alcohol and bring it back. An irony of our exhibit, when we first started working on it, Cardston was still under local option laws, and the populace finally voted to overturn the ban in September of 2023. So our panel is incorrect. So the Direct Legislation Act was brought in 1913, and it was basically with resistance from politicians, prohibitionists would shift to taking that question directly to the people. The United Farmers of Alberta, which at this point was still an advocacy group, lobbied the Liberal provincial government until they passed what would be called the Direct Legislation Act. And it was officially known as an act to provide for the initiation of approval legislation by the electors, and it allowed ordinary Albertans to propose legislation as long as they could gather a petition of at least 20% of the electoral roll from those at least 85% of electoral districts, and the signatures in those districts had to represent at least 8% of the district population. If the legislature did not pass the proposed legislation by the end of the legislative session, there would be a provincial plebiscite to allow for a direct vote. And only 2 petitions ever reached the threshold for a plebiscite vote, and that was to enact prohibition in 1915 and to repeal it in 1923. There were later efforts for further petitions, including attempts to bring back prohibition, but none of them would have the necessary support for a vote. And the Direct Legislation Act itself was repealed in 1958. So the 1915 plebiscite, in October 1914, the Dries had gathered enough signatures to force a vote on prohibition, and a plebiscite was announced for July 1915. The vote was straightforward. It was a single choice box. Do you approve of the proposed act, the Liquor Act? Voters could check a box for yes or no. Prohibition would win by 58,295 to 37,509 votes, with 70% of eligible voters turning out. The timing of the vote may have also affected its outcome. With the First World War going on, alcohol production seemed incongruous to the war effort. And I pulled this one out just because it's kind of one of the interesting records we found, and it's a poster. It's actually quite big, but this one's partially in Ukrainian, so there's sort of evidence of support and outreach happening in some of these immigrant communities. So there were a variety of unintended consequences from this, which we'll sort of touch on as we go along. These were at the very start. We'll start with these ones, and there'll be more. So various industries would be affected by the ban. Obviously, distillers and brewers were hit immediately, having to either shut down or focus on export, and we'll come back to that a little bit. There were other industries that supported the liquor trade that would suffer as a result of the act. So hoteliers were reliant on alcohol sales from the hotel bar, and they were particularly hard hit, as were the towns that relied on their services. A lot of the time, if there was no hotel in a town, it would make it very hard for people to move there. In addition to providing lodging for immigrants new to the area, they provided opportunities for newcomers to build community relationships and business connections. The use of alcoholic beverages for medicinal purposes was exempted under the Liquor Act, and alcohol could be sold to anyone with a prescription. Abuse of the system became rampant very quickly. So doctors, veterinarians, and pharmacists could make a lot of money handing out and filling liquor prescriptions. In Irricana, population 112, prescriptions for 1,052 ounces of alcohol were handed out in January of 1919 alone. And there was even a letter back and forth between the Alberta Provincial Police and the Deputy Attorney General just about how much alcohol was being sent out this way. Eventually, doctors would be limited to handing out only 25 prescriptions per month for 8 ounces each, having to fill out and submit liquor prescription pads like the one that there's a picture of here, and remit their totals to the government, but issues with compliance would consist throughout. And while selling alcohol in Alberta was illegal, importing it across provincial and international boundaries was not. Reports were filed of liquor coming into Alberta via provincial and national borders, openly on trains by people insisting they were traveling secretly through mountain passes and farmers' fields. Basically, it was just coming in wherever it could. One of the richer sources of content when researching this exhibit turned out to be the Attorney General's files on Prohibition, which is a collection of police reports and letters to and from the Attorney General. The files document how localized the conflicts over Prohibition were. So concerned citizens would write in to report the sale of liquor in their towns, sometimes signing their names, sometimes not. The letter that you see there was signed cryptically from one who knows. So a lot of this stuff was coming in anonymously. And then, manufacturing for export was actually illegal, as well as it was for medicinal, sacramental, and industrial reasons. Remaining brewers and distillers faced regular investigations from the police to ensure they were not selling to the locals, and some of them definitely were. When Prohibition came into effect in the United States in 1919, Canadian brewers and distillers themselves in dry provinces happily supplied alcohol to American bootleggers. So if there was money to be made, it went regardless. So when Prohibition came into effect, enforcement in Alberta was still under the purview of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, which eventually became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. While a utopian vision for soldiers returning from the First World War was often invoked by Prohibition supporters, the soldiers themselves were actually not particularly in favor of it. And that's why I included this article here, which on October 12th, 1916, a mob consisting of soldiers returned from Europe and ordinary citizens, men and women alike, would storm the Royal Northwest Mounted Police Barracks in Calgary to free 5 soldiers who had been convicted on Liquor Act charges. The mounted police themselves, who were stretched thin because so many officers had left to join the military and they had new national security responsibilities, they had very little interest in investigating liquor infractions. And you can tell from a lot of their reports that the official reports, that they would honestly rather be doing anything else. They would suspend operations in the province altogether on March 1st, 1917. And Alberta would have to bring in its own police force, and they did. And so this was the first iteration of the Alberta Provincial Police. The newly created APP would take a much harder line than the Royal Northwest Mounted Police. In terms of enforcement, And it would prove effective. In 1919 alone, there were over 2,000 convictions related to Liquor Act infractions and 175 stills seized. And I had this off to the side, but just even the statute creating the force is kind of ridiculous in what it mentions in terms of how vigilant they were supposed to be in trying to find alcohol, because it's just enough. Holding up, it's just from the statutes of Alberta. But it's the wording. So province to search and enter and search any of the places here mentioned, and to stop and detain while traveling a vessel, canoe, carriage, wagon, cart, sleigh, or other vehicle or means of conveyance of any description, and to search all parts thereof of any kegs, barrels, cases, boxes, or packages, or receptacles of any kind of spirits, strong waters, spirituous liquors, wines, or fermented or compounded liquors, or intoxicating drink of any kind. Like, it goes on and on. It's this is just me. If anybody has seen The Fugitive, it's the whole doghouse outhouse. Like, it has kind of a feeling of that to it. However, the cost to operate the force would rise exponentially. So when they first started, I think it was $181,317 in 1917, and by 1922 it was $557,103 just to operate, which was more than 5% of the total provincial budget. By 1932, the high cost of operation combined with the Great Depression led to the APP being disbanded and the RCMP coming back. And so as Prohibition continued, it became clear, like, law enforcement was becoming the scapegoat because it was floundering in areas of the province where it just did not enjoy popular support. The Alberta Temperance and Moral Reform League was regularly criticizing authorities both privately and publicly in the newspapers, and government officials would run their own editorials firing back. So this was a very, all of this was happening very publicly and openly. The United Farmers of Alberta, who by then were actually a political party, would campaign and become the provincial government on better enforcement in 1921, but they didn't fare any better once they were elected. And this is just a great photo. We use this one for most of our promotional materials. So while activists and politicians were openly fighting it out, people at all levels of society were just openly flouting the law. At the Alberta Hotel in Blairmore, miners and local politicians alike were openly buying whiskey at the bar. They even had different, the fancy whiskey for the fancy people and the not so nice stuff for the lumberjacks and everybody else. In farming communities in the Peace Country, stills were being found everywhere from pigsties to church basements, and alcohol was being sold on the side from distillers who were only supposed to make it for export. So widespread disregard for the law was rampant, even among people who had initially supported prohibition. Basically, people openly supported the idea in principle, just not for themselves. One of the early arguments for returning to legalization with regulation was that prohibition was leading to a lack of respect for the law in general. People who had never thought of breaking the law previously were openly breaking liquor laws and potentially other laws in the process. On March 8, 1919, a group made up of former soldiers, hotel owners, businessmen, and others attended a public meeting in Edmonton to air grievances about the Liquor Act. And that meeting would result in the establishment of the Alberta Moderation League, who would be instrumental in getting prohibition repealed. The League adopted the tactics of prohibitionists, so they were circulating petitions with the goal of getting their own plebiscite. And they would continue to gain wider support, particularly in urban areas, as it became clear that the law was not working. One of the most famous court cases, if not the most famous court case from this time, was the Picciarello case. So on September 21, 1922, Emile Emperor Pic Picciarello and Florence Lissandro, the wife of one of his employees, shot and killed Alberta Provincial Police Constable Stephen Lawson. Picciarello was a bootlegger who was working in the Crow's Nest Pass, but he was also a very popular alderman of the community of Blairmore. And he had received false information that his son had been shot and killed by Lawson during a shootout earlier in the day. His son had actually been shot in the hand, but had survived. And Emile and Florence confronted Lawson at his home. It's unclear which one of them fired the fatal shot. Lysandra initially took responsibility as they didn't think a woman, well, they think because they didn't think a woman would be executed for murder, but she did later recant. The pair were both convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Lysandra would be the first and only woman hanged in Alberta's history. And many were absolutely appalled by the harsh sentence, and public opinion really started to turn against prohibition enforcement. So by 1922, even staunch supporters were really starting to concede that it wasn't working. The Alberta Moderation League took advantage of the shifting sentiment and collected the signatures necessary for a new plebiscite. So the new vote would be ranked and have 4 possible choices. A was prohibition, B, licensed sale of beer, C, government sale of beer, or D, government sale of all liquors. The Moderation League would focus their efforts on encouraging people to vote for Clause D, which would also allow beer to be sold on licensed premises. The United Farmers of Alberta government was also hoping people would vote D because low crop prices in the 20s had put a hole in the provincial budget, and the government was eyeing the tax revenues from liquor sales. And on November 6, 1923, the votes were counted and Clause D won the day and prohibition was over. So the plebiscite would replace an outright ban with liquor stores controlled by the Alberta Liquor Control Board, or the ALCB. Licensed establishments such as bars and restaurants could also serve alcohol. But the fight for prohibition didn't end with the 1923 plebiscite. Militant Dries continued to lobby to close down beer halls, and Wets lobbied for looser restrictions on beer sales. The general public basically just moved on. The ALCB and its official stores would control how and when people could purchase alcohol until another provincial budget crunch led Alberta to become the first province to privatize liquor sales in 1993. So that's it for the formal bit. If you do ever want to contact us about anything about this or any other subject, I've included the contact info here and I can send that along as well. And if you'd like to visit the Provincial Archives of Alberta, we are located on 8555 Roper Road and open to the public Tuesdays through Fridays from 9 to 4:30. And you can peruse the content that we do have digitized up on our website, which is theprovincialarchives.alberta.ca. And that leaves times for questions. And hopefully people have questions.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I didn't know most of that. I didn't realize that it was still controlled until 1993. Actually, I was still a kid, but I had no idea. That's not that long ago. Does anybody have any questions? You can either put them in the chat or you can just unmute and ask.
Question unrelated to prohibition, just as like a farm kid.
Okay.
When did UFA stop being like a lobby group and a political party and start like running a farm and fuel store? Like that's quite a shift.
Well, they started off as an organization for farmers, really. It was a lobbying group for farmers. And some of that sort of infrastructure with the stores and the feed stuff, that's kind of where it started. They took the step into the political realm, but after they left office, they kind of ceased to be as a political entity and went back to being the lobbying group. But there was a little bit of drifting back and forth. Alberta has an unusual history in that often once a political party, I don't think we've ever had a political party come back into power after they've been voted out. So that just for whatever reason here, once they're out, that's the end of the party. So
interesting. I also really liked the part about just like the rampant disregard for the law. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, it was.
Sorry, go. Yeah.
No, it was interesting to see sort of how people, at least, there were attempts to try at the beginning, and sort of by the end, everybody was doing it, and it was everywhere all the time. So
Yeah, the follow-up part about like I agree with it in principle, but not if it impacts me. I feel
Yeah,
like that is
basically,
still so valid.
it was very much an other people need this, but not me kind of law.
I feel like that is so valid in some of the issues that we're still talking about today. Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
Is there any other questions or just as we go here, I'm gonna put a link to our survey in the chat box. So if everybody could take time to quickly fill that in, that'd be amazing. Thank you. Oh, wait, maybe I didn't. I put it to the wrong spot. Hang on a minute. There we go. Yeah, so is there no other questions? Thank you, Sarah. This was awesome. I definitely want to come learn more. This kind of been really interesting. I've been really looking forward to this Knowledge Thrifty Thursday. So yeah, if there's no other questions, I guess everybody's free to go. I can stay on after in case anybody uh, anything's been brought up or anything for anybody. But if not, yeah, I guess everybody's free to go.
And like I said, if anybody has follow-up questions, like I said, I'll send along all of our contact. And please feel free to ask me. Ask me anything. Well, archives and stuff related. Maybe can't answer anything else.
That was super interesting. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
That was really great. Great job. Thanks so much, Sarah. That was fascinating.
Oh, no problem. Not a problem at all. I know it's frustrating because we were able to put up exhibits like this. I mean, it's a very small space for us, but if people don't
Mm.
have a reason to come out here, they don't usually see it. So
Yeah, but so it's still up, right? Is
it
it?
just came down.
Did it?
Yeah,
Oh,
like yesterday.
oh, there you go.
We were at the tail
Oh,
end of it.
yeah.
We're bringing in a new one.
It would be awesome to see that stuff in person. So cool.
Yeah, the pictures and everything are so like I was trying to
Right?
read the articles as as they went by because it's just also
Yeah.
that stuff is so interesting.
I can send a copy as well.
Ooh.
I've got one giant file in this somewhere, and I was trying to figure out which one it is because it's